Richard never thought much about his mornings. They were simply the start of another day, a routine he had followed for decades. But one morning, everything changed. The alarm blared, jarring him from sleep. Without thinking, he threw off the covers and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The moment he stood up, dizziness struck like a wave. His vision blurred, his heart pounded. He reached for the nightstand, steadying himself until the sensation passed. It wasn't the first time. Brushing it off, he walked to the kitchen, muscles stiff from sleep. No water, just coffee. The bitter warmth filled his body, but not his energy. He skipped breakfast. He never ate in the morning. Instead, he laced up his sneakers and pushed himself through his usual workout, convinced that discipline was the key to longevity. But that morning, something felt different. By the time he finished, exhaustion weighed on him in a way he couldn't ignore. His heart still raced. His hands trembled slightly. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring at his empty coffee mug. Why did he feel so drained, so depleted, before the day had even begun? As he sat in silence, his eyes drifted toward the bookshelf. Among the rows of books, one stood out, The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat Hanh. Margaret, his late wife, had loved that book. He hadn't touched it since she passed, but now something pulled him toward it. He picked it up, flipping through the pages until a highlighted sentence caught his eye. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, but also take care of your body, as if you were to live forever. Richard read it again and again. For years he had prided himself on being productive, efficient, strong. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had he been living all wrong? What if the way he started his day, rushed, rigid, thoughtless, wasn't making him healthier, but quietly stealing years from his life? That morning, Richard didn't push forward. He paused. And in that pause, a question surfaced. What if the secret to a longer, healthier life wasn't about doing more, but doing things differently? What about you? If you've ever woken up exhausted, if you've ever felt like your body is running on empty before the day even begins, you're not alone. There are hidden habits, ones we barely notice, that may be silently draining our energy, our vitality, and even our years. But the good news? We can change them. Join me as we uncover 4 common morning habits that could be secretly shortening your life, and discover how a few mindful changes can transform not just your mornings, but your entire well-being. If this resonates with you, take a deep breath and begin this journey with me. And if you find these insights helpful, support this channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Let's wake up, not just to the day, but to a better way of living. Richard never imagined that something as simple as waking up could be harming him. For most of his life, mornings had been about urgency. The alarm would blare, and he would spring out of bed as if answering a call to action. In his younger days, when he had a classroom full of students waiting, this made sense. Time was precious. There was always something to do, somewhere to be. But now, at 72, that sense of urgency no longer served a purpose. And yet, his body had not forgotten the habit. Every morning, he woke up to the sharp sound of his alarm, heart pounding, breath unsteady. His vision would blur for a moment, forcing him to grip the nightstand to steady himself. It passed, as it always did, but a thought lingered in its place. Why did waking up feel like such a shock to his system? One morning, after catching himself gasping for air yet again, he sat on the edge of his bed staring at the floor. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the clock on the wall. His wife, Margaret, had always moved through mornings, so gracefully. She had never rushed. Even when she had a long list of things to do, she woke up slowly, with intention, as if honoring the new day rather than fighting against it. He had never asked her why. Now he wished he had. His eyes wandered to the bookshelf where her favorite books still sat, untouched since she passed. One of them caught his eye, The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat Hanh. He pulled it from the shelf, fingers brushing against the worn pages, and flipped through until his gaze landed on a passage she had once underlined. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, but also take care of your body as if you were to live forever. Richard read it again. He closed the book and let out a long breath. He had spent years believing that moving faster, pushing harder, was the key to staying strong. But what if that very urgency was working against him? He thought of something he had once seen in a Buddhist garden, a lotus flower blooming at sunrise. The petals did not force themselves open. They unfolded gently in harmony with the light of the morning sun. What would happen if someone tried to pry the flower open too soon? Would it blossom? Or would it tear apart before it had the chance? That morning Richard tried something different. Instead of leaping out of bed, he let his body wake up in its own time. He kept his eyes closed for a moment and placed a hand over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm. He took a slow breath, then another. The dizziness never came. When he finally sat up, it was not abrupt. It was not rushed. It felt natural. The next morning, he did the same. He noticed how much calmer he felt, how his heart no longer pounded. The moment he woke up, he moved through his morning with more ease, more awareness. For the first time in a long while, his body felt like it belonged to him, not to the demands of a schedule he no longer needed to follow. Later, he learned why this change had made such a difference. During sleep, the body is in a state of deep rest. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, muscles relax. It is a time of healing and restoration, but waking up too suddenly shocks the system. Blood pressure spikes. Cortisol floods the body. The heart, which had been resting, is suddenly forced to work harder. It is like throwing a large stone into a still lake. The water does not absorb the impact gently. It ripples violently. Richard thought about how he had been treating his own body like that lake, disrupting its calm every morning without a second thought. He thought of all the years he had spent rushing forward, convinced that speed equaled strength. But now he was learning. That strength could also mean stillness. That moving gently with awareness was not a sign of weakness but of respect, for the body, for the breath, for life itself. He never set another blaring alarm after that. Instead, he chose a softer sound, something that eased him into wakefulness instead of dragging him out of it. He no longer jumped out of bed, but instead gave himself a few quiet moments to breathe, to feel, to be present. And his body thanked him for it. So many of us wake up each morning without a second thought. We rush into the day before our bodies have even had a chance to adjust. But what if we treated waking up as a sacred moment instead of a task? What if we let ourselves rise like the lotus, gently, with patience, in harmony with the day ahead? Tomorrow morning, when you wake up, try this. Keep your eyes closed for a moment. Feel your breath. Place a hand over your chest and notice your heartbeat. When you sit up, do so slowly, without urgency. See how it changes the way you feel. Because the way we wake up is the way we live. Richard had never thought much about water. Coffee? Absolutely. Every morning, without fail, he would shuffle into the kitchen, half awake, and go straight for the coffee maker. The rich, dark aroma filled the air as he poured himself a steaming cup, taking that first sip as if it were the very thing pulling him into wakefulness. It was a ritual he had followed for years, never questioning it. But one morning, as he stood by the window, cup in hand, he felt something different, a heaviness, a sluggishness that clung to him like fog. His head ached slightly, his body felt stiff. The coffee didn't seem to be working the way it used to. He frowned and rubbed his temples, then glanced outside. The small patch of garden in his backyard, one Margaret had tended so lovingly, looked particularly dry. The soil cracked in places, the leaves on her once thriving basil plant curling at the edges. A week without rain and it was already struggling, and then something clicked. Wasn't his body the same? All night, his body had gone without water. Hour after hour, it had worked silently, repairing, detoxifying, restoring. But like the garden, outside without water in the morning, it was running on empty. How had he ignored something so simple? That morning, before reaching for his coffee, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He drank a glass of water. The warmth of it spread through him, like something his body had been craving but never asked for. He sat quietly, noticing how different he felt. Not jolted awake like coffee made him feel, but naturally alert. clearer somehow. It wasn't just his imagination. Why water matters, the science behind hydration. When we sleep, our bodies lose water through breathing, sweating, and metabolic processes. By morning, we are mildly dehydrated without even realizing it. This dehydration isn't just about thirst. It affects everything. Our blood becomes thicker, our circulation slows, and our heart has to work harder to pump oxygen to the brain and muscles. For older adults, this is even more critical. Studies have shown that chronic dehydration can increase the risk of high blood pressure, strokes, kidney issues, and even cognitive decline. The simple act of drinking a glass of water in the morning can lower blood viscosity, improve circulation, and give the body the hydration it needs to function properly. Richard had spent years believing coffee was what he needed in the morning. But coffee, a diuretic, actually made dehydration worse. It was like trying to fill an empty well with sand instead of water. He thought again about the garden outside. Would he ever expect those plants to thrive if he gave them nothing but heat, but no rain? So why had he expected any different from his own body? A Buddhist perspective. Water as a sacred act in many Buddhist teachings. Water is not just a physical necessity. It is a symbol of purification, of renewal. In temples across the world, monks pour water over statues of the Buddha, not just as an offering, but as a reminder that life must be nurtured, that the body and mind must be cleansed and cared for. Richard had never considered drinking water as anything more than a biological function. But that morning, as he lifted his glass again, he imagined it differently. What if this, too, was an act of mindfulness? He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool liquid pass through his throat, imagining it reaching every part of his body that needed it. Not just drinking, but receiving. Not just hydrating, but nourishing. That thought stayed with him. The next morning, and the one after that, he made a small but powerful change. Before coffee, before anything, he drank water, and as he did, he whispered a quiet thought to himself, "I'm taking care of myself." A small change that makes a big difference. Many of us go straight to coffee, tea, or even nothing at all in the morning. But just like a garden left without rain, our bodies suffer in silence when we ignore hydration. Tomorrow morning, before you do anything else, try this. Place a glass of water by your bedside tonight. When you wake up, before reaching for your phone, before thinking about the day ahead, take a sip. Feel it wake up your body from the inside out. See how it changes the way you feel. Richard never imagined that something as simple as drinking water in the morning could change his energy, his focus, even the way he moved through his day. But then again, he had never paid attention before. Now he does, and his body thanks him for it. Richard had never been much of a breakfast person. For as long as he could remember, mornings had always been about getting straight to business. Food could wait. There were always more important things to do. Even in retirement, when the rush of work was no longer a factor, the habit remained. His mornings followed the same routine. Wake up, drink coffee, maybe go for a walk. But food? It never crossed his mind. For years he believed skipping breakfast was harmless. He wasn't hungry in the morning anyway, so what was the point of eating? But over time, he started to notice small changes. By mid-morning, his energy would dip. His thoughts felt foggy, his focus unsteady. He would find himself forgetting small things, why he had walked into a room, what he had planned to do that afternoon. He dismissed it as part of aging, something inevitable. But was it? One day, while sorting through old books, he came across a travel journal he had kept during a hiking trip with Margaret. He flipped through the pages, smiling at the memory of those winding trails, the crisp mountain air. But then one passage caught his eye. "We packed extra food today. Margaret says you can't walk a long road on an empty stomach. She's right. The climb felt easier. My legs had more strength. The journey was better when we were nourished." Richard closed the book and stared at the words. A long road. His life now was its own kind of journey, a slower one, but no less demanding. His body, his mind, they still needed fuel. But for years he had been expecting them to keep going, without giving them what they needed. That morning, instead of ignoring breakfast, Richard made a small change. He poured himself a bowl of oatmeal, sprinkled some almonds on top, and added a few slices of banana. It wasn't much, but as he took his first bite, something unexpected happened. He enjoyed it, not just the taste, but the act of eating itself, the quiet, the stillness, the simple nourishment. For the first time in years, he wasn't just feeding his body. He was caring for it. Why breakfast matters. The science of nourishment. During sleep, the body works tirelessly, repairing cells, balancing hormones, processing memories. By the time morning comes, it has gone 7 to 8 hours without food. Blood sugar is at its lowest, muscles are depleted of energy, and the brain is in need of fuel. Skipping breakfast means the body continues running on empty. For younger people, this might mean mild fatigue or irritability, but for older adults, the effects can be far more serious. Studies show that regularly skipping breakfast can lead to muscle loss, cognitive decline, and an increased risk of heart disease. The brain, deprived of glucose, struggles to function properly, affecting memory, focus, and decision-making. Richard had spent years thinking he didn't need breakfast, but in reality, his body had been asking for it all along. He just hadn't been listening. A Buddhist perspective. Eating with awareness in Buddhist practice, eating is not just an act of survival, it is an act of mindfulness. The Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote, "When you eat, eat." It seems simple, yet how often do we eat while distracted, while rushing, without truly tasting our food? Food is more than sustenance. It is a gift from the earth, from the farmers, from the hands that prepared it. To eat mindfully is to recognize this gift, to appreciate the nourishment it provides, and to honor the body that receives it. Richard thought about this as he sat at his kitchen table, his oatmeal slowly disappearing with each thoughtful bite. Eating was no longer just about filling an empty stomach, it was about being present. For the first time he understood what Margaret had meant on that hiking trip all those years ago. You can't walk a long road on an empty stomach, neither in the mountains nor in life itself. A small change, a better morning. Many people skip breakfast without realizing its importance. But if the body is expected to function, to move, to think clearly, it needs fuel. Tomorrow morning, if you're not used to eating breakfast, try something small. Start with a piece of fruit, a handful of nuts, a slice of toast. Notice how your body responds. Over time, build from there, a little more each day, like strengthening a muscle. Richard never imagined that such a simple change could make such a profound difference. But now, each morning when he sits down for breakfast, he is reminded. A well-nourished body carries a well-nourished mind, and the journey ahead is always easier when you are ready for the road. Richard had always believed in discipline. For decades he had followed the same rigid morning routine: wake up, lace up his sneakers, and dive straight into exercise. It had started when he was younger, back when his body felt invincible. Running. That dawn, lifting weights, pushing himself harder each day. It made him feel strong, in control, as if he were keeping time itself at bay. Even in retirement he clung to the habit, but one morning something changed. He had barely rolled out of bed when he stepped onto his mat and began his usual routine. Deep squats, push-ups, stretches that pulled at his cold, stiff muscles. The whole first few minutes felt like any other morning. Then a sharp pain shot through his lower back. He froze. The ache was deep, unfamiliar, and unsettling. He tried to shake it off, but the discomfort lingered, a dull reminder of something he didn't want to admit. His body was not the same as it once was. Frustrated, he sat down on the edge of his bed, rubbing his back. He looked outside at the small creek behind his house. The water, barely moving, reflected the soft light of dawn. It wasn't rushing, wasn't forcing its way forward. It moved gently, easing into its own rhythm, letting gravity guide its course. And then he thought, why was he treating his body any differently? He had always believed exercise had to be intense to be effective. But had he ever stopped to ask what his body actually needed? The science of moving too fast. What Richard didn't realize was that his body, like the earth itself, has its own rhythms, and sleep is its deepest state of stillness. During the night, body temperature drops, circulation slows, and muscles relax. When we wake up, our joints are stiffer, Our heart rate is lower and our body is not yet ready for sudden, intense movement. Jumping straight into vigorous exercise can shock the system. Blood pressure rises too quickly. Muscles are forced into action before they are warm, and the risk of injury increases. For older adults, it can be even more dangerous. Sudden spikes in heart rate can increase the risk of heart attacks or dizziness, leading to falls. Richard had spent years thinking that strength meant pushing harder, but what if real strength meant moving with awareness, not force? A Buddhist perspective. Moving like water in Buddhism, movement is not about force, it is about harmony. The body, like nature itself, thrives when it moves with, not against, its natural state. The creek outside Richard's window did not rush as soon as the sun rose. It started slow, gently flowing before gaining momentum. No river crashes forward the moment the sky turns light. No tree stretches its branches all at once. Why should the body be any different? Richard decided to change his approach. The next morning, before diving into push-ups and squats, he took a few moments to breathe. He closed his eyes and focused on his breath, letting his body wake up naturally. Then, instead of high-intensity movement, he started with gentle stretches, rolling his shoulders, moving his arms, flexing his fingers and toes. He stood up and took a slow walk around his living room, feeling his muscles loosen, his blood begin to flow. Only then did he move into his usual exercises, but this time his body felt ready, not forced. And the pain in his back? It never returned. Simple shift that changes everything. Many of us wake up believing that more is better, that pushing harder, moving faster, is the only way to stay strong. But the body is not a machine. It is not meant to be jolted into motion like an engine. Tomorrow morning, try this. Before any exercise, start slow. Take a deep breath. Stretch your arms above your head. Roll your neck gently from side to side. Walk a few steps. Feel your feet connect with the ground. Let your body tell you when it is ready, rather than forcing it into action. Richard had spent years believing that power came from intensity, but now he understood something deeper. True strength is not about how hard we push. It is about how well we listen. And just like the quiet creek outside his window, the body moves best when it flows, naturally, gently, with purpose. Richard never thought that small changes could make such a difference. He had spent decades waking up the same way, abruptly, rushing into the day, believing that urgency was the key to staying strong, staying alive. He had ignored the quiet warnings of his body, brushing aside the dizziness in the morning, the exhaustion that settled in too early, the stiffness in his joints. These things, he told himself, were just part of aging. But what if they weren't? 3 months ago he had started making changes, not drastic ones, not overnight transformations, just small shifts, like a river slowly carving through stone. He let himself wake up gently, breathing deeply before stepping out of bed. He drank water before his coffee, allowing his body to rehydrate after a long night's rest. He ate something in the morning, even if it was just a handful of almonds, and a slice of fruit. He stopped pushing his body too hard right after waking up, choosing instead to start his mornings with slow stretches and mindful movement. At first, these changes felt almost too small to matter. But then something happened. The dizziness faded. His energy lasted longer. His body no longer felt like a weight he had to drag through the day. His mind, once clouded by fatigue, felt clearer. And most of all, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, at ease. Not just physically, but mentally. His mornings were no longer a battle to get through. They became something softer, something he actually looked forward to. He thought back to the words he had read one morning, the words his wife had once underlined in a book she loved. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, but also take care of your body as if you were to live forever. For years he had lived only by the first half of that sentence. He had moved fast, done more, refused to slow down. But now he understood the second part. Taking care of his body wasn't about restriction or control. It was about listening. It was about meeting each morning with the same patience and kindness that nature shows to all things that grow. We often think that change must be something dramatic, something overwhelming. But real change is quiet. It happens in the smallest choices. The way we wake up, the first thing we give our body, the way we move, the way we nourish ourselves. And over time, those choices shape not just our days but our entire lives. If you have ever felt exhausted before the day has even begun, if your body has ever felt like it is working against you instead of for you, maybe it is time to listen. You don't have to change everything at once. Just start with one thing. Maybe tomorrow you wake up a little slower. Maybe you drink a glass of water before anything else. Maybe you eat something small instead of skipping breakfast. Maybe you stretch before you move. Just one thing. And then, see what happens. Richard never expected his mornings to feel different, but they do, and yours can too.